Hi, it's Shadow Hero 90, welcoming you to my show, Sexism in Movies and TV, where I more or less call out the insane level of misandry that these retards in Hollywood put in both film and television. Now, I've been doing this show for 7 years. But the reason as to why what you'll be seeing this season could be worse is the fact that it's marketed towards children. A demographic that doesn't exactly know how the world works and can easily be misled. Now, what I reviewed in the Season 6 finale was gynocentric, sexist, and misandric to a degree where there's no way I would be able to get through a third viewing of this piece of shit. I'm currently working on this book. In this book, I'm going to be proposing a theory. And part of that theory is that gynocentric shows, like the ones that I will be attacking this season, are the reasons why young boys and young men have such unbelievably low self-esteem. And it's because that all of this sexist bullcrap is marketed to kids. So, anyways, I welcome you to the 7th season of Sexism in Movies and TV. Okay, in this episode of Sexism in Movies and TV, I'm going to be doing a review that is probably going to make me a lot of enemies. And that is the review of the episode of Codename Kids Next Door, Operation Future. Just yesterday, I saw Mr. Enter's review of the Cartoon Network show Out of Jimmy's Head. And they had what he called a sexism episode in that show and compared it to the piece of garbage that I'm about to rip to shreds. A lot of people within the animation reviewing community really like this episode, but yeah, this episode fills me with a lot of disgust. And yeah, this is gonna be one of those episodes where I more or less give you a quick recap as to what this episode was about, and then I rip it apart telling you every single thing wrong with it. The episode starts with number 4 being shipped off to a private school. It's apparently an all-girls school because it only has women acting as teachers. And we find out that the headmistress is actually a girl in a robot suit with a plan to take over the world by turning all of humanity into girls. Number 4 escapes, but the kids next door were already hit with her gender-swapping laser. Then we cut to the future, and we have the resistance, the boys next door, and the granddaughter of number 3 for some reason goes rogue and decides to help the boys next door travel back in time, stop Margaret's evil plan, and more or less save the world. They go back, they send old man number 4 back in time. He stops her, they save the world, the end, and Margaret basically just breaks down and cries. That's her punishment. Before making codename Kids Next Door, Mr. Warburton produced a pilot for a show called Kenny and the Chimp, about a boy Kenny and his pet monkey. Now, in all fairness, I saw it. It was a really good pilot. And to be blunt, I actually did hear somewhere on the internet that the kids next door were originally meant to be a part of that show if it got greenlit, and that they were meant to be bully characters. And in hindsight, I really think that would have been the better option, as Oh Yeah Cartoons had a short called Kid from School. Basically, it's about a kid version of James Bond. And in my opinion, this does what Kids Next Door did for 4 seasons a lot better. But as to why, well, I'll get to that later in the review. Yes, and in hindsight, yeah, after every bad thing I've ever said about American television, it would have been a way better move for Cartoon Network to greenlight this, and Nickelodeon to greenlight this, than both pilots getting dropped and Kids Next Door ever being made. Okay, next thing I'm going to touch on is the fact that Margaret gets absolutely no punishment for what just happened. She literally sent a robot back in time in an attempt to, more or less take over the world, transform half of the populace of Earth into girls, and more or less do something that she called a utopia, but was a dystopia, and it could have ended all life on Earth. And breaking down and crying, well, that's the closest thing she gets to a punishment. She deserved far more. I mean, if she had, say, 3 older brothers who were abusive, that would be something if they came in and just started beating her up. In fact, now that I think about it, she's basically a sexist little cunt. In all fairness, she has no motivation to do this. The abusive brothers route could easily be motivation to do this, but they never went there. This little cunt tried to take over the world, turn everyone into a girl, and when she failed, her crying is the only thing she gets as punishment. She should have, in all fairness, there are tons of ways you could have punished her. Since they know what she did in a hypothetical timeline, maybe force the entire world to enslave the female gender. Maybe if she was on a leash and constantly told that this was her fault, then this episode would have had a purpose. If she was turned into a boy and forced to experience a lot of the negative things that the male gender experiences on a regular basis, she might learn her lesson, but not likely. But in all fairness, the idea of her pulling the stunt and it backfiring would be a pretty good, worth the payoff. This little cunt and her followers almost caused the apocalypse, and the little, like I said, cunt who caused it gets no punishment. Her being thrown to the ground where she starts crying and throwing a temper tantrum like the spoiled brat that she is basically the punishment she gets. That isn't a punishment. That's letting an evil cunt off the hook. And in all fairness, within the first 3 episodes, before the reveal that the headmistress was actually this little cunt in a mech suit, everything was set up very well. You'd actually think that a lot of people who like this show and say that this episode was done correctly were right. But no, they're wrong. Just like every other sexism episode on American or on TV in general, this one bombed. It bombed hard because, as a bigot, Margaret was set up as a very good antagonist, but she gets no punishment whatsoever. Okay, and this brings me to the boys next door. I know they have to call them that because this is rated TVY 7 and not on Adult Swim, but these are not boys. These are cucks. These are the cucks next door. In all fairness, dictator they want to overthrow is basically a bigot and has been for her whole life. Her setup as a villain never had an origin. There was no backstory for her. She's just a bigot, hates men, is what she is. Now, we would want to see these characters win. And when I say that, I mean without the use of time travel. You want to see them actually overthrow her, defeat her, and then execute her. But we don't get that. Instead, these losers only have one shot at victory, and instead of it being a last-ditch resort that they found, it instead comes in the form of help from a defector. People praise this episode in particular as being a sexism story done right. The villain was established right, but it was executed horribly. The cucks next door literally need help from a defector so that they can go back in time and stop this bitch's rise to power. If this show wanted to say the genders were equal, then they would have stopped that cunt all on their own. They wouldn't need a defector. But since they only win when one of Margaret's soldiers goes AWOL and helps them, that literally implies that girls are better than boys, because the cucks next door only won when they had a girl on their side. For this storyline to work properly, not only would it have to be the series finale, but they would have to find a way to overthrow this cunt on their own. I mean, maybe they could find a long-lost machine that this cunt built and threw away, but they reverse engineer it and find a way to undo all the damage she did. Or hell, maybe they could have built a time machine of their own and assassinated this little cunt in the past, preventing the dystopian future they live in to, well, keep it from ever happening. In fact, that would have been a better option, even if it's not meant to be the series finale. The boys next door find, say, a failed time machine that Margaret built. They reverse engineer it, find a way that they could make it work, and then basically show up in the present and more or less blow up the school she was running, as well as killing her in the past. That would have been a way better ending. I know you wouldn't be able to show it on screen with the rating the show has, but it would have been way better than what we got. Okay, and now it's time for me to ask the question that I'm constantly asking in these reviews. And that's, what if the genders were reversed? Let's say there's this greedy, evil male character who develops a laser that can turn girls and or women into boys and or men. He uses this weapon he uses this device constantly in an attempt to take over the world. I guarantee you that in the real world, people won't enjoy seeing this on TV. It could be a bit of an insult to the transgender community, but nevertheless, I guarantee you that if any studio made an episode of any show like this, or made a movie like this, that everyone on social media would instantly cancel them once it either aired, if it's a show, or had its opening night, if it's a movie. Okay, earlier in this review, I mentioned how the cucks next door literally were only able to topple Margaret's regime because one of her own went AWOL and decided to help the boys next door. Now, I actually did mention other ways, I did mention other possibilities that the cucks next door could have used to win against that sexist cunt. But one that actually the writers didn't think of and would actually work would be hypnosis. Either that or some other form of mind control. But since it's not likely that the cucks next door would be able to capture one of Margaret's elite long enough to brainwash her, yeah, you just have to go with the hypnosis plan as a solution that would topple Margaret's regime without any hint of time travel. This solution works because it would be the fastest way for the cucks next door to bring this war to an end, and, well, not only is this sort of thing common in cartoons, but in all fairness, this would be an ending that would give Margaret actual consequences to her actions. She spent her entire life trying to get rid of boys, but by doing so, she escalates the situation to a point where the boys next door resort to using hypnotism and turn all of the girls in her regime into their mindless slaves. And they would then lock Margaret up and potentially execute her. Even though that part may have to happen off screen, it would be a way better ending than the one we actually got. Okay, I will admit that we would never get that on a kid's show. But it would be, well, a good ending would go halfway there. You could even make it like a Pokemon thing. All the cucks next door would have to do is use hypnosis to enslave one of Margaret's troops. Have her infiltrate the ranks of that cunt's organization and trick others into the same situation that she's in. You could even make it like a Pokemon thing. Or better yet, a Pokemon parody. After the cucks next door basically were able to hypnotize one of Margaret's troops, say starting with a lowly scout, they could have her lure more into a hypnotic trap. Then, afterwards, climb up the ladder until Margaret herself becomes paranoid and has no idea who she can trust. Eventually, she'd come to the realization that the resistance had, well, hypnotized every single girl on the planet except for her. They lock her up, and she spends the rest of her life watching every girl in her empire essentially get reduced down to a mindless slave for the enemy that she wanted wiped off the face of the goddamn planet. Hell, I mean, when you look at the massive number of female characters in cartoons that get hypnotized, it would not surprise me if someone who worked at Cartoon Network actually spoke out and said that he suggested this as an ending, but then someone shot him down, saying that such an ending would be sexist, which in turn would be hypocritical to say that this hypothetical ending would be sexist. Tell me if you've heard this one before. An episode of any show wants to be pretentious and make a statement about sexism, so they turn all the male characters into sexist morons who end up getting cucked so that the girls can swoop in and save them at the end, as well as making both sides into nothing short of sexist stereotypes. If it sounds familiar, it's because it's the plot of every single goddamn episode of anything that has tried to do this message. Every sexism storyline fucking sucks because they all do this. If you think that this ending, well, what I just proposed, would have been better than what we got, then please feel free to tell me in the comments below, and I may even write this in the form of a spec script as an alternate ending to Kids Next Door Operation Future. Okay, I'm just gonna say it. The Kids Next Door are terrorists. And yes, I know that number 4 was a member of the Kids Next Door before forming the Cooks Next Door, but in all fairness, the Cooks Next Door are supposed to be seen as heroes fighting against an evil matriarchy, modeling them after the group that is, well, an amalgam of Youth Revolution and Al-Qaeda is not exactly, well, good for making intelligent people see them as the good guys, even though we do. And this isn't really me looking too far into this. My dad actually saw an article on the internet where this show was being criticized for what I just said. The Kids Next Door are terrorists. They were originally supposed to be bully characters on Mr. Warburton's other pilot, Kenny and the Chimp. in all fairness, I really think he should have stuck with that idea. Because, in all fairness, in retrospect, when I look back, the k.n.d. are just a bunch of terrorists. The movie was the only time they were ever heroic. They have attacked... they attacked a roller derby rink in Season 1 completely out of their own paranoia. And later on, they... Number 1 here let a deranged lunatic loose in an office building just because they had a dress code. This is not a good look for someone that you want to say are the good guys. People say that these characters are heroes, but in all honesty, they are villains, except for the events of the movie. That's the only time they were heroes. Hell, when they did the imaginary story, Operation White House, that turned out to be nothing more than a virtual reality simulation, the writers basically just got really meta with the statement that if the kids next door were real, they would be seen as terrorists, because they are terrorists. My dad, who's in his 70s, did see an article on the internet criticizing this show for that fact. And the last thing that you ever want to do with a resistance-type group fighting against an evil dictatorship, Star Wars, is portray the resistance or as terrorists, Star Wars, or model them after terrorists. To be fair, you might be able to draw a comparison between the Cucks Next Door and the Joker clan from the Injustice series, but there is one major problem with that. The Joker does become a figurehead of rebellion because Superman was so pissed off about basically the fact that the Joker drugged him and tricked him into blowing Metropolis up. But regardless, the Joker is a villain, and you don't want to model your resistance group, or secondary resistance group in this case, after a villain. Specifically, the villain who caused this mess in the first place. Hell, it would have worked a lot better if DC used the Sons of Batman in that storyline instead of creating the Joker clan. Which brings me to the worst part of this. The Cucks Next Door are modeled after the kids next door, who were basically just a bunch of immature terrorists. And this is something that is not aged well in hindsight. The kids next door were nothing but immature terrorists. And when you model someone like the Cucks Next Door off of them, the only resistance group to ever exist in fiction to take on an evil matriarchy, well, let's just say that could easily be seen as a fuck you to MRAs, MGTOWs, and members of every other men's rights groups out there. 'Cause since the cucks next door were modeled after the kids next door, it basically implies that someone who would dare stand up to an evil matriarchy is nothing more than a childish terrorist. And that is insulting. And like I said further, imagine if the roles were reversed. I mean, just imagine a group like Bossy Riot from The Simpsons actually being written in a way that's realistic, where it's more or less them throwing a temper tantrum because Principal Skinner banned sandals. When you model the cucks next door here after the kids next door, you kinda run into that problem. When you do a storyline that everyone else has fucked up, and even if you start out decent with a decent antagonist who herself is nothing more than a good-for-nothing bigot bent on destroying the planet to get rid of the people she hates, well, that's a good start. But everything in the episode must be perfect. If it's not, you run the risk of basically creating the exact same type of abomination that I rip apart on a monthly basis. In hindsight, I would prefer a world where Mr. Warburton actually produced Kenny and the Chimp instead of Kids Next Door, and Kid from School was made into an actual series as opposed to Kids Next Door. And since I am the king of unpopular opinions, I'm just gonna say it. Operation Future was not... I mean, it was garbage. It was not the typical sexism plot, but done right. It is just as goddamn shitty as everything else that I rip apart on this show. It is just as goddamn shitty as everything that you're seeing on screen. And with that said, I'm gonna just end this review. Because I have nothing else to say, but this should never have been made. This should have been made. And this also should have been made. But this should have never been made. This especially should have never been made!